Top 10 Rick and Morty Theories. Number 10. Switching Ricks. So you remember the Jerry Baree, the daycare for Jerrys that appears in Season 2 episode Morty Run? Well, it turns out that according to Reddit, the events of that episode might entirely redefine what you understand about the series. You see, the Rick from C137, the main dimension the show is set in, gets a ticket for his universe's Jerry before setting off, and when we head back we see Rick and Morty claiming a Jerry before going home. But things get a little tied up when another Rick and Morty ask if they have 5126, so they shrug and swap. And what number was the original ticket? 5126. This means that if the Rick and Morty who interrupt are in fact from C137, the whole episode could have been following another pair, while the C137 Rick and Morty were off screen, probably at the Blips and Shits arcade. And what's more, we see the presumed other Rick harvesting these green rocks, which, in the episode Total Rickle, he throws in the trash. All of this comes together to mean that at least Total Rickle, and maybe other episodes, are following a different Rick and Morty. That explains why Mr. Poopy Butthole is only ever seen with the family in his one episode, despite being real. But even better, it means that the Crombopoulos Michael in our usual universe could still be alive. But as great as this is, it kind of depends entirely on how much stock you put in a ticket. Number 9. Rick is Morty. Rick's background has always been pretty mysterious, and though we've heard some of what he might have done as a younger adult, we've never seen much of his youth. Or maybe we have. According to some, we're actually seeing Rick growing up now because him and Morty are one and the same, just at different ages. There's a few tiny clues, like this version of Rick inside the Council of Ricks, which looks suspiciously like a halfway point between the two characters. And if we take a look at Diane, Rick's wife, in his torture flashback, she looks awfully familiar, almost like Annie, Morty's crush and an employee at Anatomy Park. From that you could argue that Morty gets together with Annie, grows up with her, and becomes more Rick-like in the process. However, that does leave the question of Morty's intelligence, but I point you towards the megaseeds from episode 1. By consuming them constantly, perhaps through his flask, Morty maintains his super smarts, while maybe suffering from some drooling. However, even if you ignore the fact that Morty would be his own grandfather, there would still have to be a Rick in the first place to introduce Morty to all of this, so maybe there's still some work to be done on this one. Number 8. Tammy. Everyone hates Tammy. I mean, how could she do that to Bird Person? But what if I told you that Rick is inadvertently to blame for the eventual downfall of his best friend? Now that's a reason to say wubba lubba dub dub. So cast your mind back to the pilot episode. When Rick and Morty go on the run from the Glomflamites at the Intergalactic Customs Point, hacking their portal to get home, they arrive at Morty and Summer's school. Yes, this is the same school where Tammy goes undercover, so it's not inconceivable to say that the events of the pilot episode set in motion the events of the Season 2 finale. I mean, why were the Galactic Federation undercover at a school unless that was the last known location of Rick? So you could argue that had Rick not taken Morty to find the megaseeds in episode 1, the Galactic Federation would never have taken down Rick's resistance cell, and Phoenix Person might never happen. But right or wrong on this one, Tammy is still terrible. Number 7. The Gravity Falls connection. Crossovers are nothing new in TV land. Some people even think that pretty much all TV exists in the mind of a kid who's on an obscure 80s TV show. But right now, we're talking about Rick's connection to Gravity Falls. The cartoon's creator Alex Hirsch acknowledged the references, but some think it goes much further. Rick and Gravity Falls supposedly have a history. We can see very clearly, but very briefly here, that the same objects fall into Grunkle Stan's portal and out of Rick's, so we can establish that they at least share a multiverse. Going deeper, Ford's wanted poster has this coded message, which when deciphered, reads Rick was here. Clearly, these guys know each other. From there, some fans have suggested that Rick is responsible for Ford's dimension hopping, not to mention his infinity-sided die, which is banned in 9,000 dimensions. I mean really, who other than Rick Sanchez, wanted criminal and intergalactic arms dealer, is going to provide Ford with interdimensional contraband technology? Number 6. Rick knows he's in a cartoon. Like everyone from Deadpool to Frank Underwood in House of Cards, Rick has a habit of speaking to the audience or making meta-references to the plot. So it's a pretty straightforward conclusion that he knows there are people watching him. But what if we take it to the next dimension? At the end of Season 2, Mr. Poopy Butthole gives the audience a little hint about the wait for Season 3. but crucially, he does it after finishing watching the same episode the audience does. That means Mr. Poopy Butthole is aware that Rick and Morty is a scripted TV show. None of the characters have control over what happens on screen. So what if he told Rick that? Loss of control over your life decisions is a pretty good way to develop a drinking problem. Now before you jump into the comments, I wouldn't put too much stock in this one. Justin Roiland and Dan Harmon actually addressed this theory, saying that speaking to the camera was just a bit of fun. Number 5. Immortality. The most common question about cartoons has to be, why don't they age? I mean, in The Simpsons, Bart should be 38 and Homer 64 by now, but at least there's an idea for Morty. He doesn't age because he's immortal. So back in the pilot, Rick gives Morty a serum for his broken leg, but he added that it came from a place with technology so advanced that they halted the aging process. Some fans have taken that to mean that as a side effect of fixing his leg, Rick also fixed Morty's eventual death. But why doesn't Rick do the same? I mean, we've already seen him experiment with aging through Tiny Rick, and the answer might come from co-creator Dan Harmon himself. In his Reddit AMA, Harmon said that he's trying to stay true to himself, which also might mean that he wouldn't want immortality to mess up his normal lifespan, not to mention that he has already attempted suicide on screen. Number 4. Multiverse theory. Science is the backbone of Rick and Morty. Well, discounting alcoholic nihilism of course, Adult Swim even calls the show its most scientifically accurate comedy, so some academics decided to swap fan theories for actual scientific ones. It of course definitely wasn't just an excuse to watch cartoons at work. No way. Anyway, they said that the show's conception of dimensions and the multiverse is pretty far off, but there are some nuggets of scientific potential. That's according to colliding bubble theory, which, according to Durham University researchers, says that another universe might have bruised our own and left it with a so-called supervoid in space. So maybe that's how portal guns work, but according to Richard Matzner at the University of Texas, that's about where it stops. Rick once told Morty that there are infinite universes. Most of them have a Rick, and most Ricks have a Morty. But in reality, there are probably more like 10 to the 500 or just under septuaginticentillion universes, most of which probably have next to nothing in them. But accurate or not, Bullfondlers is enough to make me believe in the show's multiverse. Number 3. Still inside a simulation. We all remember the insane layers of realities in the Season 1 episode M. Night Shyamalan's, but what if I told you that the real world inside a simulation was actually inside another simulation? And even worse, it still is.
Oh, this is going to be such a mindfuck!
But first, some context. We see that when Jerry escapes the first simulation into the second, his tuxedo still exists. But when he goes into the real world, it disappears. That's all fine. But if we look at when Rick and the simulated Morty are escaping, Rick leaves his clothes at the school and somehow has them back on in the next scene. So we can only assume that Rick has got new simulated clothes. But they never disappear when the Zygarian ship explodes. Assuming this admittedly minor detail pans out, almost the entire series from that point on could be a fabrication of the Zygarians. If that's the case, then kudos to them. That's a lot of effort to go through for some concentrated dark matter. Number 2. Rick's wife. Remember that show from the 90s called The Magic School Bus? No, me neither, but there's a chance Rick might remember a lot more than that. You see, the internet seems to like the idea that Rick's wife was actually Mrs. Frizzle, the Magic School Bus teacher. On a basic level, it's because she has red hair, just like Summer, who might have inherited it from her. But beyond that, we see in autoerotic assimilation that Rick's fantasy with the hive mind unity involves a football field full of, yep, redheads. The Magic School Bus also tended to go travelling inside the human body, which is exactly the idea behind Rick's Anatomy Park. So for all we know, they worked on the concept together, maybe even collaborating on the shrinking tech in general. But what about Rick's wife Diane? Well, we know the memory was made up, so there's no way to know what Rick's real wife even looked like. Besides, if you're looking for reasons for Rick's alcoholism, a bitter divorce seems a pretty good one. Number 1. Evil Morty. Even though he has only appeared once in Season 1, so far at least, Evil Morty is probably the most popular target for fan speculation in the whole show. And while there are a lot of ideas out there, the go-to is that the eye patch sporting, possibly cyborg villain is in fact our Rick's original Morty. The idea is that Rick had another Morty before his current one, but he abandoned his actual grandson for whatever reason, causing him to become bitter and oh so vengeful. We all know how Rick treats our Morty, so it makes sense that if he did have another sidekick before, he could have been even worse to him. And we've already seen how Rick is totally fine abandoning entire dimensions. Sorry, Cronenberg world, but the most compelling hint is that in Rick's on-screen memories, we see a baby Morty, despite Rick supposedly leaving his daughter Beth 6 years before he was born. So maybe this is our Rick's original Morty in another universe where he didn't abandon his family. The events of the show are just set in another dimension. So that was the top 10 Rick and Morty theories. Which one blew your mind the most? Let us know in the comments below, and make sure to like and subscribe. While you're at it, check out this great all-time 10s video on screen now.